pawn to between two rooks. In this video, we're talking about the rarest chess move, en passant. Even though the move is very rare, it's important to know it and be able to use it in your games. So hopefully, after watching this video, you could easily recognize it and notice in your games and understand it better. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about the historical moment behind this en passant move. Long ago, pawns could move only one square up. So in this position, black could move only to b6 with their pawn. And then c5 pawn would be happy because it could easily take on b6 if it wanted to. But then it was decided to make games faster, to allow pawns move two squares up from their starting position. So after b5, the c5 pawn was no longer happy. So after that, they decided to give such pawns a chance and call it en passant. En passant is French for in passing. So only after a pawn jumps two squares up from its starting position, only at this moment, not a moment later, not a move later, you can take it in between, as though the pawn went to b6. To make it easier to memorize, let's call such moves with the pawns when it goes two squares up a jump. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. So I recommend saying to yourself, not out loud of course if you play somebody in a real tournament, but maybe acknowledge in your mind that the pawn jumped, and if you acknowledge it every time when you say it, that would be easier for you to spot en passants. So let me show you a couple of examples from my students' games. Here, white played g4, pawn jumped, so black can do en passant, f takes g3. Here, white played h4, pawn jumped, so black can do en passant, pawn takes h3. And here, white played pawn to b4, pawn jumped, so black can play pawn to b3 again. Knowing en passant is very important because it can help you win your game or save yourself from being checkmated. So in this position, white wins by giving the check to the king, and black jumps with the pawn to f5, thinking that they saved themselves, but white has en passant, and that's a checkmate. The same thing happened to Magnus Carlsen. In this position, Magnus was black and his opponent sacrificed his rook on h5. And after pawn takes, white played bishop e4 check. Maybe Magnus thought he had f5 move, but after pawn jumps, white has en passant, and after e takes f6 is a checkmate. It's worth mentioning that white has another en passant, g takes f6, but after this move, g pawn no longer controls h6, so the king can escape to h6 and it's not checkmate. And here, black thinks they can checkmate by playing pawn to b5, but that's a jump with the pawn, so white can do en passant, and white is safe. And here, black once again thinks they can checkmate by playing pawn to f5, but white has en passant once again, and they're safe. It's very important to mention that en passant is not a forced move. I saw some memes or shorts on the internet when people got checkmated because they did en passant. You are not forced to do en passant, but it's important to notice this move nevertheless. So in this position, black plays b5 and white can en passant because the pawn jumped. But white doesn't have to. They have a checkmate. They can checkmate themselves on h7 or even on h8 if they want to. But after en passant, white gets checkmated themselves. Another example is that here black plays c5, and once again white can checkmate. White can take on g7 with their queen because the bishop supports it. Instead, white does en passant and black checkmates. To sum up, en passant is a magical move that's possible to make when a pawn jumps from its starting position, and only at that moment the opponent pawn that stands next to them can take them in between like this. It's not a forced move, so you can choose whether or not you want to take it this way. To make sure you understood the topic correctly, I'm gonna give you 5 puzzles where you just need to tell me whether or not you can en passant. You can look at the position and write your answers in the comment section down below, and I'm gonna check them and tell you whether or not you're right. So, the position number 1, black plays pawn takes on d5. Write your answer. Position number 2, black plays pawn to d5. Position number 3, black plays pawn to d5. Position number 4, black plays pawn to b5. And the last one, position number 5, black plays pawn to g5, and that's a check. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully that was useful, and let me know if you have any questions. Remember about pawn jumps.